Welcome to the Fane of Fantasy. This channel is all about giving you inspiration to master your craft and create fantasy that will truly immerse your audience. So today I'm joined by Amanda, and we are going to talk about something that we actually have not touched upon at all on this channel before, and that is scientific rationale when world building. That sounds perhaps very complicated, but I'm sure it's going to be very inspiring and helpful as well. So Amanda, maybe you will say a few words about yourself and maybe what you're writing and so forth.
Sure. My name is Amanda Justice. I write under the name AM Justice, which are my first two initials and my last name. And I write science fantasy. And if you've never heard that term before, it's actually an older term. It's another word is low fantasy is another term that's frequently used for the genre. But it's basically fantasy that has a science fiction framework. The best known works of science fantasy are Star Wars, of course.
Yeah, we like that.
Yeah. Anne McCaffrey's Pern books are science fantasy. The Dune series is science fantasy. So these are books where there is frequently some sort of, it could be a space opera setting with some kind of mystical elements or magical elements, or in the case of Anne McCaffrey's work and my work, it's more like what appears on the surface to be a traditional epic fantasy type of thing with maybe medieval level technology, but it's also occurring on a lost space colony where the human beings in the book all have ancestral roots on Earth that can be traced back to Earth. And so they have historical origins on Earth, and they have some kind of historical records of high tech, of spacefaring technology. So, and so in my work, I like to have sort of a non-mystical source for people's supernatural powers. In my case, it's biological. A good analogy to that is in Star Wars, and I'm probably going to say this wrong, but the midichlorians, I think they're called. So.
It's so funny you said that, because I was just sitting here thinking about what was it that it was called, and I couldn't come up with the word either.
Something like that. So I'm not as up on my Star Wars lore as I ought to be. But basically, it's kind of the same kind of deal where there is a biological organism that actually gives people who can use the Force their power. And I have a similar situation in the world that I've written. But another example that I love to talk about is the movie Avatar, and the fact that Ewa, who is a goddess to the Na'vi, the native people of the planet Pandora, when the humans arrive, they figure out that there's actually a biological neural net that connects all of the species on the planet. So it's sort of like that mix of finding the scientific explanation for the mystical occurrences that are going on.
Yeah, and I picked up when this whole midichlorian, or whatever the right word is for that, somebody will butcher us in the comment field, but that's okay.
I know.
Whatever the right word is, but the thing was that when that kind of came up, because I think that was introduced into the Star Wars universe quite later, in the later movies or stuff like that, as kind of an explanation. I think maybe it was when we got to see Anakin Skywalker as a child, but it also got a lot of flack at that point, that it was a lame thing to introduce. And then what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I don't think it's lame at all. I think that it's necessary and it's nice. And there's a saying that all magic is really science that we don't understand. And I think I'm a big believer in that. I think that phrase might have appeared on Doctor Who, which, by the way, is another science fantasy show. Anything that we don't have a scientific basis for right now is technically fantasy. faster than light travel is fantasy. We don't have, there are some theories about how that might work, but nobody really can make it work, and it doesn't, and it's still the explanations that we have for the physical universe don't really allow for faster than light travel. So, and yet practically every science fiction show that exists that involves space exploration has ships that are able to travel at near or faster than the speed of light. So these are things that I don't think is inconsistent at all with having, particularly in a Star Wars universe where you have, where it is basically a science fiction or a space opera setting. So why is it inconsistent to introduce a biological or a scientific explanation for the mystical occurrences that are happening with the Force? That doesn't make sense why people would be upset about that.
Yeah, I don't personally, I don't know one way or the other what I think about, but I think what people complained about was also that it was introduced so late, you know, that it was like a new thing that they kind of, well, let's do this thing as an explanation all of a sudden, like 3 movies later, and I guess that was what people complained about. But what I'm wondering as well is when we are having some kind of this scientific approach to world building, is it in your mind important that we do have, or is it important that we do have like scientific or biological, whatever that might be, however we classify scientific in this sense here, but it's important we have some kind of explanation rooted in science in that sense, or could it just be like it's magic because it's magic, or how do you see that?
I mean, I'm a fan of the idea that there's got to be an explanation for everything. So, you know, someone who's writing really traditional epic fantasy where there are gods and there are wizards and there people are doing magic, it's fine if they don't want to have any kind of technical explanation for what's happening in their own work. There's nothing wrong with straight classical epic fantasy, Lord of the Rings, where it's sort of very, very mystical in terms of where the source of people's power, and things just sort of happen in the way that gods can just snap their fingers and, you know, say, let there be light, and then there is light. You don't, but I think that for authors who are interested in having a world building that is consistent with, that puts their world in the context of our world, and in a world where the physics work consistently, then I like to see a little bit of more shape to what's going on and some sort of rationale toward this. In Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series, there are allusions to the time when the Aes Sedai in the ancient distant past, that the society actually was fairly technologically advanced, and there were people who were studying the One Power as scientists to figure out what it was. And when I got to that part in that series, I thought, oh, wow, that's pretty cool. So Robert Jordan's actually putting a little bit of science fiction into his very classically epic fantasy. Got this history there in his world building where there was a time when the people who wielded the One Power also studied it as scientists, rather than just trying to think of it as more of like a mystical thing that had more like religious connotations than and so forth. So I really love that part when I got to that part in the series. And I like seeing those types of explanations, because I think that's also human nature, is that we tend to want to explain the world, and we explain it the best we can with the knowledge that we have. And 500 years ago, the knowledge that people had was they could only work with what they could observe directly themselves. And so the best guess for the origins of the universe was a God. It was God, and it was a creator. Now we have a broader understanding of how things work. There's still room for supreme beings if you want to have them in your worldview, but you don't have to have them in your worldview anymore. So I like that openness.
Yeah. So for us world builders here, so when we're building a world with a scientific rationale behind it, where do you start with all of this? What are the things that you need to consider that you wouldn't on if you didn't have a scientific approach to it?
My first thought is assuming that your story is not set on Earth, is how did the people get there? Where did they come from? That's the very first consideration that I have. And then how far removed are they from their Earth origins, assuming that they come from Earth. But let's, for the sake of argument, let's say we're talking about writing a story where human beings are the main characters. So first is, how did they get from Earth to whatever world that they're on? Or if they are still on Earth, how did the Earth get to its present condition? So I haven't read this Sword of Shannara series, but I understand that is actually set in a distant post-apocalyptic future on Earth.
Yeah, that's right.
That was something where, there was thought into how we got here from, the time period that we know. And so that's where you begin, is where do people come from? And then what cultural aspects would be, would flow through to that time. In my own work, the stories are set approximately between 1,000 and 3,000 years after a crew of a spaceship was marooned on this planet. And so the cultures are completely different from what they would have been of that ship's crew when they landed. And they've sort of evolved into cultures that we are familiar with on Earth. So there's a place that's very much like ancient Rome, and there's a place that's sort of like perhaps medieval or Elizabethan England, maybe, in terms of the way people interact with each other and the cultural mores and the way that society is structured and so on and so forth. So and that's just sort of how I imagine that, given human beings and the way that we exercise power over one another and so on and so forth, I think, those types of empires sort of would probably flow naturally over time as people develop and change and expand out and settle new areas and so forth.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and to that end, of course, apart from the fact that we are dealing with maybe people on another planet, or we're dealing with a distant future here, then I write in the medieval settings, but it's kind of the same line of thinking in terms of you need to explain why is the society this way and that way and so forth. But where is it that scientific elements are playing a particularly important role? Is that with magic, or is it also just in general, like hyperdrives and stuff like that, or where do you see it most the science parts?
Well, I think, again, it depends on the work that you're doing. And if you're writing a book that's set in medieval times or in a society that's very much like a medieval setting, and you have you might have the scientists of the day, so they might be alchemists, but maybe the work that they're doing should be based either on the research of what alchemists actually did, or but alchemists were the early scientists. So alchemists and philosophers and natural philosophers, those were the world scientists 600, 1,000 years ago. And a lot of them were, they're always depicted in books and movies and stuff as charlatans, but they didn't think of themselves as charlatans. They really were trying to figure out how to make gold out of lead, and they really thought that they could do it. And it was just a matter of figuring out how to do it. So they ran a lot of experiments. And so I think that if you're working in that way, then you really need to, it's helpful to understand what type of work they actually would have been doing and what in real life would actually stop them from making gold out of lead, which are on the periodic table are separated by 1 proton. So what they're really trying to do is nuclear fusion, is create some kind of mechanism by which you can add a proton to that atom and convert from one substance to another substance. And then if you want them to be able to do that, that would require some kind of probably magical force. But if maybe you're writing where they find some sort of artifact, perhaps it's an alien artifact that actually permits them to generate the amount of power that they would need in order to actually make that transition happen, which is a transition that with our current technology now, we cannot do. You know, we have superconducting super colliders, and we can't make or we can't make gold out of lead. But who's to say that on some alien world that another society would not have invented the ability to do that? If there actually would be a genuine use for that, who knows? You know, other than using gold as your monetary, there's no real reason why you actually would want to convert lead into gold. So, you know, but those are the types of things that I think that people should be thinking about. So even if they're writing in a traditional setting using magic, you know, think about what you'd really be doing with the magic. If your wizard is in a desert and needs to make water because they're going to die of thirst, how do they make that? What is water actually made out of? So they need to somehow pull together oxygen and hydrogen atoms out of the air and stick them together somehow in order to get water to pour out of the sky. So those are things that, you know, I think are important for any kind of world building or magic system that you're doing, is figuring out like what actually is happening, what materials would be needed in order to achieve the goal that you want your character to achieve.
Yeah, and that's a good explanation, and I can certainly also hear the kind of scientific approach being at play here, because you're thinking about atoms and how to do it and all of that, where in a very, let's say, high fantasy setting, we'll probably just say, well, it's because it's magic, so they'll do it. But what lies at the core of this is still what you also touched upon, that either way, if it's scientifically explainable or if it's just because it's magic, there still have to be that reason for it, like just touched upon. You know, there is no point in, well, as you said, creating gold just because. You know, there has to be a reason. I mean, maybe they're doing intergalactic trading or something, and they need something currency or whatever. But for sure, they won't sit on a foreign planet and have no contact to anybody else and have no need for currency, and then let's make gold. that would not make much sense.
And who's to say, and that's another thing, is that who's to say that gold on another planet would be the currency of choice? Maybe you're on a planet where gold is plentiful. Maybe, you know, you're always walking down the street and kicking these heavy, shiny rocks, and they're just everywhere. Well, then it's not going to be currency.
No, water could be currency, essentially.
It might be pretty, but it's not valuable. So, because it's not rare. Yeah. So that's another thing, is that when you are building your world, you have to think about, you know, sometimes you can be a little creative and say, well, maybe on this planet, copper is the rarest substance. And that is what people really value. And that's what you know, maybe it's beyond, it's, you know, it's so valuable that it's actually, you know, priceless. Or there could be other things. You know, that example happens to be a situation from my world, because the world has a shortage of malleable metals. So people actually use diamonds, which they call crystals, but they're essentially diamonds, which are plentiful. But that's what they use as currency, because they're plentiful, and they're rare enough that they have value, but plentiful enough that you can pass them around. You know, you have enough of them that you can pass it around. So
yeah, that's cool. But it was funny because when you mentioned The Alchemist before, I was thinking about it kind of links to what you just said about trying to think a bit differently with things. Because I watched and now the name of it, of course, escapes me. But I watched like it was a Japanese movie on Netflix the other night. And it was with alchemists, but it was not the alchemist in the sense that that you normally perceive alchemists. They had actually kind of made it so that the alchemists were well, they were using magic, but not to produce gold or anything like that. But they were basically like government, not spies, but more like investigators. And they would use magic to go out and investigate things and stuff like that. It was pretty cool because it was a very different take on something you normally see and think about when anybody mentions alchemist. So I kind of I always like the approach of doing something differently with what you might expect.
Oh yeah, yeah, I totally agree. I think that makes it exciting if you can do something and just change, change the role of what a person does, and you know, again, that brings up another idea of what, you know, CSIs do to a person from 100 or 200 years ago. To them, that would seem, a lot of it would seem like magic, of, you know, holding a black light over something to reveal invisible blood stains. It's like, whoa, who, you know, that seems like magic unless you kind of understand what's actually happening, what the ultraviolet light is actually showing you. So
yeah, and a lot of this also goes into or you could let it play into your character development and creation as well, on how the whole science things affects people's perception of the world, or how it kind of shapes their attitude to maybe other races and stuff like that. Do you have any good experiences with anything like that?
Actually, in the world where my novels are set, there's sort of a religious schism between the people who have records and understanding of their Earth origins, and that they came from somewhere else, and other people who have developed a mythology for human origins on this world. And so the people with the mythology sort of, they have this belief that their God, who the spacecraft that brought everybody to the planet still orbits the planet.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have a moon, but they have this spacecraft that orbits the planet, and so it appears from the ground as a very bright star. And most of the people on the planet have come to worship this star as their god. And they have this legend that this god came down to the planet and mated with these trees, which is kind of a wild thing, but there are sentient trees that can move on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And so their god mated with these trees and produced humankind. That's their myth. Okay. And then other people on the planet who think that is absurd. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. That thing that's orbiting, that circles our sky at night, that is a spacecraft, and that's where we came from. So you have these people that have sort of like the science-based belief of their human origins, and then you have other people with a religious-based belief of human origins. And it's also intended to explain the fact that they're alien, that they live on an alien world with strange creatures, including trees that can move and have knowledge of the world, even though communication with the trees is basically impossible because, you know, things are too different. There's another alien species on the planet that humans do interact with. There are actually two other animal species that are sentient that human beings interact with. And So they had to develop, as their societies develop over time, they had to develop these explanations for where people came from in this world where people are so clearly different from what is basically the native fauna of the world. So, and of course, as people do, most people sort of came up with a religious origin for all of this once they forgot what their or what their actual origins were, that they came from the spacecraft.
Yeah, true, and that's again one of the good examples of what we talked about before, that when you can't explain something, then it kind of either it's magic or it's religion. Right. in a lot of fiction, that's the way it works, right? Right. But here also lies a lot of potential for creating the conflicts between nations or people or maybe other planets, something like that, where you can find ways to build off generating a conflict or even a war situation, kind of, because we are either in different points of view, or maybe it's back to the kind of resources that we talked about before. Maybe the other planet have what we want.
Right. Yeah, totally. I think, that's, you look at human history, and what do we fight with each other about? We fight over resources, and we fight over religion. My God is stronger than your God. Yeah. So, and it's definitely a source of conflict between people, and sometimes at the micro level, individual to individual, but then also at the macro level too. So. Yeah.
Exactly, and I also like I kind of like the idea of developing a more scientific kind of character. I mean, certainly in my world building, that's not something I've done a lot, because I usually have kind of a high magic setting where magic is because there's magic. There's not always any explanation to why magic is. It is just there. But I kind of like the idea to play with creating kind of a science-based character that in one way or another would look into why things are the way that they are.
Yeah. Yeah. I would love in like the J.K. Rowling, I would love in Harry Potter for like a physicist to be introduced to that world, or maybe one of the people from the wizarding world to go to college and study under Stephen Hawking or something, or have some kind of, I would love for her to create a character who bridges that gap and can and who wants to go and figure out exactly how the wizarding world makes their stuff happen. I think that would be a lot of fun. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And also because you're basically creating this kind of fish out of water situation with that character, which also bridges a lot of the gaps towards the reader in terms of explaining why things are the way they are, but you can do it in character and make it interesting rather than explanation.
Yes. And that's, I think those fish out of water characters, the stranger in a strange land characters, are always the perfect character for you to introduce readers to your world, because then that character, the reader experiences the world along with the character and has things explained to them as the character, as they're explained to the character. So that's good. And so maybe in your books, having some scholar come out of the library and with the thought of like, I'm going to figure out how this is really working, a Galileo character or Leonardo type character who's a real thinker and is thinking about like, well, wait a minute, things don't just happen because they happen. There's got to be some sort of explanation for what's going on here and why we have magic in the world. So.
Yeah, exactly. And my mind always goes directly towards conflict for some reason. But if this guy could kind of gain a following on his own, and he would go up against the mages of the world or something and saying, well, what you're doing is nothing special, really. and they would be pretty upset about that, I would imagine. saying that what we're doing is not special. What do you mean? We are mages. So that could be, and if he can gain a bit of a following in his line of thinking, then you kind of, then it's not religion, but then it's kind of the same conflict, but over magic, you know, science versus magic conflict. That's pretty interesting.
Especially if your books, the you know, magic users are restricted to a certain class of people, so that it's limited. You know, like you're not allowed to become a mage if you come from a certain background. But you know, and then that can be a source for like this guy's motivation is maybe he was kept out of mage school, and so, you know, in revenge, he's like, you know, I'm going to take those people down.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That gave him the motivation as well. So, and maybe his father was this science guy who was always thought like a complete moron or something. You know, you're crazy, and then he kind of said, okay, maybe he was onto something. I don't know. That's cool. So for those watching, that's a story idea you can steal right away there if you want, and build that one and then tell us about it. We want to hear what that happens in that story. I think that sounds interesting. All right. So Amanda, we're coming up on time here. Is there anything we kind of forgotten to say about a scientific approach to world building that we need to tell people about before we finish off?
I think you know, the important thing is, and I know you've touched on the topic of research in some of your other conversations with people, and a lot of times people think of doing research for fantasy worlds as historical research to sort of get their cultural ducks in a row. And I would just say that if you are, that I think having an understanding of the way ecosystems work and so on and so forth, it is useful for building your fantasy world. And one other example on that topic that I would give is, we think about George Martin's Song of Ice and Fire, and he has this scenario set up where they have these winters that last for 100 years in some cases. And the question that I'm always troubled by when I read that is like, if a winter lasts for 100 years, forget the people surviving, because the people can always import grain or whatever if they need to. But how does the ecosystem survive that? How is it that there are trees in north of the wall when there's always snow on the ground? And what do the animals eat that live there? And how, you know, the herbivores, and the trees are mostly pine trees, but in our world, you know, we still have summers where there's a growing season. And if you're going to have 100 years where there's no growing season, that's how has the ecology managed to survive that long? So those are things that I would love to get an answer for, is like, how does that work? And you know, that there's a pretty rich environment that we see in the books and also in the show, but I just would like to know how it can possibly survive a 100-year-long winter. So
I'm pretty sure that the answer is just because.
Just because. Magic.
Yes. Oh, that's good. So Amanda, where can people find out more about you if they want to check you out on the interworld?
Well, they can visit my website, which is amjusticeauthor.com. My first novel, which is called A Wizard's Forge, which is here, is available. Thank you. And it follows a character who is relevant to this conversation. She's what they call a heretic on her world. So she's somebody who believes in the earthbound origins of her people, but she encounters most of the people that she encounters in her travels do not agree with that, and they believe that they're in the mythology that I talked about with the god that mated with the trees. That's actually incidental. That's more background information. It's not really relevant to the main conflict of the story. Hers is a story of human trafficking followed by escape from slavery, and then and then a desire and an effort to get revenge on the person who had held her captive. So it's a revenge story in that, but that's the setting. And you know, I hope that you'll check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll post links in the description field as well for you guys out there watching, so you can go directly from there to the different places on the internet where you can find out more about Amanda. So I want to say thank you so much for watching today. And as usual, if you check out the description field there below, you will also find a link over to Patreon where you can support this channel if that's what you want, and you will get some cool rewards in return. So otherwise, all there is left to say is thank you for watching. Stay safe out there, and see you next Monday.